Okay, so welcome to Module 12. We have talked now about community ecology, ways that people can describe community ecology. And now I want to talk a little bit about what causes diversity. Why are there more than one kind of thing in communities? There is a chapter that talks about sort of the diversity of life, chapter 18. When you read this, you're not going to find a lot of material that matches what I'm going to tell you today, but I want you to sort of read this and think about the incredible diversity of life that exists on Earth. Why are there so many different kinds of things? It's not obvious that there should be more than one kind of thing, right? Why isn't there one superorganism that's incredibly good at everything? And maybe that seems like a trivial question to you, but it turns out to be actually really complicated. So just a quick review of community ecology. We've defined a long time ago communities as groups of populations from multiple species in a single place. We learned about how, a little bit after that, we learned about how functional traits are often thought to define the niche of a species, right? So, the fact that eagle has wings and an earthworm can burrow through soil, that those traits that they have that allow them to do those things tells you something about their niche in an ecosystem. We learned about the open and closed community concept, right? So these multiple populations that are in the same place at the same time are not like a superorganism. Rather, they just happen to be a chance collection of organisms that happen to be able to get through those ecological filters of history, abiotic and biotic filters. We learned how ecologists mainly describe community structure in a number of ways, including species richness, abundance, composition, and the interactions among species. These are things you should know. And we learned how communities change through time via succession. And finally, we learned that communities don't seem to be saturated with species, so the niches don't all seem to be full, right? We can apparently keep adding more species to existing communities, making them more and more diverse, filling more and more niches, which is a bit surprising even to this day. So today I want to think about some of the mechanisms that cause and maintain patterns of biodiversity. And these are mechanisms of coexistence. So we're going to go through this list of a number of specific mechanisms of coexistence that ecologists think about. And so let's start with the competitive exclusion principle. This is usually taken back to Georgie Gauss, another old dead white dude, who, remember, we looked at these in the context of population biology and competition. He studied paramecium species in competition, and he was able to show that when you grow them separately, they each go to a carrying capacity, but in mixed population, paramecium aurelia would actually drive the other one extinct under certain conditions. And so the idea was that two species that use the same resources, or that have the same niche, right, two paramecium species, are probably a lot more similar than an eagle and an earthworm. So two species that use the same resources probably can't coexist. And related to this idea is an idea that I think is worth thinking about, and that's the paradox of the plankton, which is a really famous paper by our old friend G. Evelyn Hutchinson. This is a picture of him holding a monkey. Here's a picture of him next to a tortoise for some reason. Right, so competitive exclusion says that species that use the same set of limiting resources can't exist. Gauss showed that with paramecium species that this was true. But Hutchinson studied pond communities frequently, aquatic systems. And, he would look at like plants and algae in a pond. You can have dozens and dozens of species of phytoplankton, these plant-like single or slightly more complex celled algae. And to Hutchinson, this seemed like a paradox. On one hand, we had the competitive exclusion principle, but then plants and green algae all require the exact same set of 30 limiting resources, right? Nitrogen, carbon, water, light, all these things. And so how is it possible for there to be incredibly high diversity of plankton? Hutchinson didn't know the answer to this, and that's why he called this famous sort of argument of his the paradox of the plankton. And you could think of the same as this picture of a grassland that I've been showing you for a few lectures now, right? All of these plants need the same set of limiting resources: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, molybdenum, boron. They need them all in the same basic proportions. And so how can there be 100 species in this field? So competitive exclusion got sort of expanded into an idea of limiting similarity by Robert MacArthur, who is another sort of incredibly brilliant ecologist. another old dead white dude. He died actually really young, and sometimes I like to think about, he was such a brilliant ecologist. He was a student of Hutchinson's. He was such a brilliant ecologist. Sometimes I like to think about what would have happened if he hadn't died, I think in his 30s, of cancer. But MacArthur and some other people reasoned that species might use the same resources, but maybe there's a limit to how similar they can be and still coexist, right? So Gauss just said, if you use the same resources, which is a yes or no question, then you can't coexist. But MacArthur said, well, maybe it's more probabilistic. Maybe if you only so instead of yes or no, maybe if you only 50% use the same resources, then you could still potentially coexist by sort of switching to alternative resources, right? So remember the concept of zero net growth isoclines, or zingies. This is one for two essential resources, light and, say, nitrogen, right? So remember what this shows you is it demarcates the regions where species can have positive population growth rates. So below the resource levels they need, they have a negative population growth, and above it, they have a positive population growth. And it's called zero net growth because right on the line they're at their carrying capacity. They have zero net growth. And if we have species that differ slightly, so the example I gave you was a shade-tolerant species that can survive with less light, but to do so it needs higher nitrogen to make more chlorophyll or something like that. Right? And we get these regions where species 1 will drive species 2 extinct, and vice versa. We get these regions where neither one of these species can exist because there's simply not enough resources. And we have this region out here where there's potentially the possibility for coexistence. And this is the idea of limiting similarity. These species use the same resources. So from Gauss's perspective, right, the yes-no, they both need light, they both need nitrogen, so they shouldn't be able to coexist with the simple competitive exclusion principle of the 1930s. But under MacArthur's conception of limiting similarity, these species are different enough that there's a chance that they can coexist in certain environments. Right, and if we go back to Sandra Diaz's work that looks at the traits of species, we can see there's a tremendous amount of diversity among the 50,000 plant species that she studied. Right, so the biggest one being herbaceous and woody species. So if we amend the competitive exclusion principle so we can say that two species that compete for the same resources in the exact same way cannot stably exist. However, if they use resources sufficiently differently enough, they might be able to coexist. So what we learned from the competitive exclusion principle and from Hutchinson and MacArthur and Gauss is, and Sandra Diaz, frankly, is that the most basic requirement of coexistence is that intraspecific competition has to be more negative than interspecific competition. And so you should know what intra and interspecific competition mean, right? In other words, what this means is that a species does worse, if a species does worse in a single species world than it does in a mixed species world, then we might be able to get the coexistence of those two species. And hopefully this should be intuitive to you if you think of a 2x2 matrix game. Basically what we're saying is that coexistence requires each species to do better in these corners in the mixed world. If that's true, then it's going to drive it away from the two monoculture worlds into the mixed world as soon as you have the ability for two species to coexist. So hopefully that is clear to you, this most basic requirement that species do worse on their own than they do in mixture. And if that's true, then the system is going to tend towards these two corners. If the opposite is true, it's going to tend to these two corners, and you're only going to get one kind of thing, or possibly alternative stable states. So the catch with species coexistence, as we've just defined it, is that it's actually really hard to study. So usually when we go out to a system, we can only observe diversity. So we see that there is more than one kind of thing. Of course, this is a necessary condition for coexistence. You can't have species coexisting if there aren't multiple species. But just seeing that there are many species at the same place and same time, that doesn't prove that there's coexistence, right? And our concept of competitive exclusion, or even of an ESS, an evolutionarily stable strategy, this is an equilibrium concept. It can take a very long, long time. If you think about the mutations necessary in some of the examples I gave you of species invading islands, that might take tens or hundreds of thousands of generations. And so competitive exclusion can take a very long time. Meanwhile, you can have density-independent factors that reset the process. So maybe this forest was on its way to some kind of coexistence, and then it burned down. I'm actually standing on the opposite side of this lake. That was a really stressful day. Right, so the catch then with coexistence is we have to study it independently. If species can coexist, they should grow better in mixture compared to monoculture. And though we might not be able to get all the way to equilibrium, except in the case of maybe microbes like paramecia or yeast or things like that. And there are a lot of ecologists that study microbial systems for this exact reason. But if we want to study things like plants, we can't study coexistence directly. We have to look indirectly. So we have to check whether the competition within a species, intraspecific competition, is stronger than competition among species. And that's often what ecologists do to try and study coexistence. So there's obviously lots of ways to get a sense of whether intraspecific competition is stronger than interspecific competition. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples. One of them was pioneered by David Tillman, who is another white dude. He's still alive. He's in Minnesota. And his idea in the 1980s was, let's plant a big garden, right? If we have this idea of how diversity should control the growth of plants, well, that's cool. We can manipulate that, right? So here's a picture of his famous experiment out at Cedar Creek. And you can basically see from the colors that you've got a bunch of different manipulated communities. I think these are 10 meters square. They're really, really big. A bunch of manipulated communities, and you can sort of tell from the appearance of them that they have different combinations of species. And the prediction would be, again, if we were together, we would talk about this, but the prediction would be plants should do better in mixture than they do in monoculture. And in fact, that's what people find. This type of experiment has been done many times. In fact, my lab actually uses this technique. I have 2 experiments like this right now, and we're planning a third. And this is what people generally find. If species can coexist, the monocultures, so one species, should do significantly worse than the mixtures. And you might expect over time, you might start to see competitive exclusions. And so if we look at the number of species that remain in the plot versus the number of species that were planted, we see that this line is bending downwards, right? It means we're losing species, or Dave Tillman was losing species through time. So over 4 years, the species richness in the plots where he put 16 species had dropped to around 12. So 4 species had been lost in that time frame. And so you actually can, if you have enough time and enough effort to weed these things, you actually can see competitive exclusion if you're patient enough. But something like this is the simpler way to sort of project the idea that, well, if these mixtures are doing better, particularly better through time, notice that as those species dropped out, the ones that couldn't coexist, this went up, that you can potentially study coexistence this way. And in fact, you can look across the entire world and see this. And so here is a map of thousands and thousands of forest plots that Jingjing Liang and al. Used to study this relationship. And what they found was that overwhelmingly in the world's forest, again, you can see the data comes primarily from where rich white people hang out, but that this diversity relationship between species richness and productivity was positive almost everywhere in the world. And he wasn't at Purdue when he wrote this, but actually Jingjing is now a professor in forestry and natural resources. So if you ever wanted to talk to someone about this, Jingjing is actually now at Purdue as of a couple of years ago. He's a really fantastic scientist. So that's one way. We can plant a giant garden. Another way is to study what we could call reciprocal invisibility, right? So what you could do is imagine we have 2 species and we want to know if they can coexist, right? We're probably going to want to use a density gradient. So the least that we can do is we can have plants alone or in competition, right? So this is a question about inter versus intra-specific competition. So we would have 2 plants competing of the same species and 2 plants of a different species competing, and then potentially also alone. So this is the minimal design that you can use to potentially get a sense of whether intra-specific competition is stronger than inter-specific competition. But of course, this is a population equilibrium process, right? And so this probably, 2 plants is probably not the carrying capacity. So what you want to do is potentially take the density out as far as you can. Obviously, these experiments depend a little bit on labor, as always. So hopefully that makes sense. And if what you do is you have more and more heterospecific species of a different species, you can ask, what if I put 1 plant? So what if we do the thing that our matrix games envisions? We do the ESS invasion. What you should see across the density of competitors is that the competition that the per capita population growth rate should decline. Their ability to reproduce should decline as you approach the carrying capacity. right? Per capita growth goes to 0. And here's our old friend lambda, the geometric rate of increase of the species that we saw in lab. So these reciprocal invisibility plots are one of the stronger ways, in my opinion, to do this. Make a monoculture of one species and ask, just like our question on the ESS island, if we make a monoculture of one species that's close to its carrying capacity, we add one individual of the other species, can it increase from rare? And if it can, then we have good evidence that these species can coexist. And so that's the competitive exclusion principle. I'm going to stop the lecture there, and we're going to talk about a few more mechanisms of coexistence in the next video.